So we have a fantastic panel lined up for today. And these are folks who have expertise that I think can provide context around the benchmark, but are not directly, deeply involved in the benchmark definition itself. So we're trying to give you the bigger surrounding picture. So we are fortunate enough to have with us April Chen, the Director of Responsible AI Measurement at Microsoft, and Nouha Dziri, a research scientist at the Allen Institute for AI, leading, I believe, a lot of work on their OMO model. And we also have joining us remotely in what I'm going to describe as an exceptional act of devotion, Wan-Si Lee, the Director of Artificial Intelligence and Data Innovation at IMDA, which is the Singapore ministry we mentioned. It is an unpleasant hour in the extreme in Singapore. So thank you, Wan-Si, and Jan Stoica, an esteemed professor at the University of California, Berkeley, who among his many achievements is one of the leaders of the LMSys chatbot arena benchmark, which is a really critical benchmark for the field at this time. So thank you very much to everyone for joining us. I'm going to start with a broad question to the group, and we'll work our way around on how you see benchmarks as being important to the progress of AI. And April, maybe you'd like to take that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me to participate in this panel. Loved all the talks earlier this morning. So I can answer that in two ways. So internal to Microsoft and external to Microsoft. So within Microsoft, we have a whole suite of tools for AI safety evaluations. Benchmarking is one of these tools. So where benchmarking fits in is it helps us provide a baseline for us to understand safety, but it is a first step. And that first baseline helps us then figure out how to prioritize additional investigations and research. So it helps us understand whether or not we need to get our AI red team involved or our research teams involved. That's internal. Externally, quality public benchmarks are so helpful for us to be able to have open dialogue and to collaborate on baseline AI safety. And from Microsoft's perspective, so many of our internal test sets are developed in a way that is optimized for our internal data, which means that these are test sets that for legal and privacy and security reasons, we're just not able to share publicly. So in a public forum, we need an alternative to do model comparison and to understand where there's still gaps for additional ways of addressing some of these risks.
Nouha, why don't we...
Yes. I think I have a microphone. I'm not sure whether you hear me. Great? Okay, wonderful. So I wouldn't use this one. Okay, about the benchmark and the importance, I would say benchmarks have a critical role in AI development, and without robust benchmark, we risk either to overestimate or underestimate the performance of our models. So without really having benchmarks, we can't do meaningful progress in AI. And I think lots of people don't even recognize how difficult it is to collect a benchmark because solving the benchmark does not mean necessarily that we solve the underlying task. And this is where we have to be very, very careful when collecting a benchmark because there are two things, maybe more, that can happen. The first thing is contamination. One of the things that can happen is that these models might inadvertently be exposed to certain training data that can be quite similar or exactly the same as our benchmark. Or they can be, like the developers can intentionally train these models on very simple or very similar example just to boost the numbers on the benchmarks because they want to ship their product, and they want to show that they have incredible performance. And so I truly believe that, as I mentioned, that benchmarks are very, very important, and they allow us to measure and understand what our models can and cannot do. So we need to do more efforts, and I'm really mind blown by the effort of MLCommons. Congratulations for the new benchmarks, and it's going to play a critical role in the community and advancing science around safety. And since I think we're talking about safety here, I don't know, probably should I stop here, or should I mention something about safety? Because today we're talking about safety. I think lots of people say that, who cares? Why do we care about a model generating a toxic comment when social media is flooded with toxic articles and all of that? And why do we need benchmark? Let's figure out how these models reason. Let's make them more capable in generating math, coding, and all of that. And I think, yeah, I mean, it makes sense. So who cares if it can achieve your task successfully, but it's actually a little bit racist? I think my concern is not there. It's concerning, but it's not the main critical part, is that these systems can be deployed in critical domains. And now they are being deployed to do things autonomously. And that's where, where it becomes super worrisome. And I think without really measuring the capabilities of these models and the amount of risk they have, we can't actually deal with more advanced systems, and more importantly, we cannot control them in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, we really are learning how to control the behavior of AI systems, which I think is just as important as capability. Yeah. Jan, please, why are benchmarks important?
Yeah, I mean, Dave Patterson, one of my colleagues and Turing Award winner, as you know, famously said that for better or worse, benchmarks shape a field. And that was not about AI, it was in general. So I think that this tells a lot of the importance of a benchmark in any field, because people and everyone who is going to create products in that field is going to try to show well on that benchmark. There is no question about that. Now, with AI, like was said earlier, things are even more complicated, and the benchmark can be even more important. And there are challenges like Corsair contamination, and there are challenges about safety. How you define something is safe or not. Even that very definition is not generally agreed upon. So I think there is a lot of, it's a very important problem we need to make progress on. And I think there is no question in my mind, and I don't think it's any question in anyone's mind, that benchmarks are going to be the key, which will shape the progress of AI the way it shapes the progress of other fields.
Thank you. 1C?
Hi, Peter. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, I can hear a little bit of echo, but I think this should be fine. Yeah, why are benchmarks important? Of course, they are one of the very common ways of testing models right now. There are, of course, other methods like red teaming and so on. But I think benchmarks allow us to have a consistent way to compare how models perform, compare different models, compare different versions of model, compare them across time, and iterations as well. So these are, I think benchmarks are definitely useful. And I agree that previous panelists who talk about the importance of benchmarks for measuring safety. Notwithstanding, I think we also recognize that benchmarks today have many challenges, right? Concerns about quality, competitiveness of various benchmarks that are already out there. As well as, there's no perfect benchmark. Even so, I think it's still very useful and directionally indicative of how the models, so they can measure specific capabilities, they can measure safety, and I'm covering certain areas where of improvement, for example. So we can identify various specific areas and then deal with them in terms of building benchmarks to measure these areas. So definitely benchmarks are very key to understanding model performance and behavior. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. I do want to draw attention to one of the, I think, things that makes us lucky to have this panel here today, which is we have a representative of industry, a representative of civil society, the nonprofit world, a representative of academia, and a representative of the policy world, all on a common stage to talk about this topic. And I think that is part of what we're trying to bring together with this work. So we heard everyone talk about why benchmarks are important, but there's a lot of benchmarks out there. So my next question, again to the panel, and then we'll ask some more specific things, is what are the characteristics of a good benchmark? What is the most important couple of things that makes a benchmark high quality, useful, whatever? April, again, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so to start, two things. Validity and reliability, and we've covered reliability in depth. When I talk about validity, what I mean is this benchmark useful? Is it actually meaningful? Because one of the things we don't want to do is hyperfixate on a metric that does not actually correlate with the outcomes that we care about. In terms of reliability, what I mean here is consistency. So if you are running multiple tests, similar outputs, does that result in similar outputs? And I think one way to think about quality metrics is also to think about what are the pitfalls for bad benchmarks. And I think some of these are already covered in the lightning talks, but three come to mind. So one I think we've talked about is this problem of oversaturation. So these are scenarios where we have test sets that are in the public domain that are widely used, and it's quite easy to develop models that look great against these benchmarks, but it's just teaching to the test like we've talked about. So these benchmarks are actually hiding a lot of potential vulnerabilities and risks. Another part of it, we've talked a lot about iteration, and I think we need to get to a mindset where this is not one and done. Our understanding of risk is evolving. Our understanding of the measurement science is also evolving. So we have to continue to iterate. And I think the last part that we have not touched on as much is so many of the questions that we're asking are questions of science, which obviously is important. But there's also open questions around policy and governance. So when we talk about hazards like violence or self-harm, and then once we start wading into other territory that can even be more abstract, things like fairness, these are quite theoretical and abstract concepts. And what we're trying to do is, if we think about something like violence, the taxonomy helps us systematically break down that concept in a way where we can then create guidance around allowable and not allowable behavior, which then creates the boundaries for what we consider acceptable. As we do this for even more abstract concepts, say, again, fairness, what we're doing is then we have to build consensus around what we consider is allowable within AI systems. So there is a huge part of this where it is the science and making sure that we get evaluations right, but there's another piece where we have to make sure we're actually tying governance and policies and how we intend to use these systems with evaluation.
Thank you, April. Nouha, would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, so I think in my view, the key criteria for a good benchmark really depends on the task, but there are common criteria that different benchmarks for different tasks should share, in my view, to have a very good quality data set. I'm going to echo some of the existing work and wonderful work that has been done in this field, but also some of my own work. I guess the first criteria is saliency. we really need to develop benchmarks that test relevant information that matters in real-world applications. To give you an example, I want a benchmark that tests, for example, a particular day in history in World War II rather than just a random day in history. And so this is very important because we don't want just to simulate some scenarios that might be fake and do not really represent the real world, and that would be problematic if we are testing our models after. The other thing that I think is very, very important, and we really need to invest more in time on it, is novelty. We really need to develop benchmarks that reveal insights in models that haven't been captured in previous benchmarks. And this is important because our models are getting better and better every day, and they're actually performing quite well, if not perfectly, on existing benchmarks. And this does not bring any meaningful insight on whether our models are doing better or not. And also, there are new kind of skills and risks that are emerging with more capable models that we are not even aware of. And so by thinking deeply about what kind of capabilities we need to come up with, just to give you an example, and since we're talking about safety today, I think it's really good to focus on the day-to-day harm and the obvious harmful scenarios, but also we have to think about certain things like sycophancy in language in AI model. Sycophancy it means that these language models or AI models agreeing with whatever the user says. And this is because these models were trained to be helpful, so in order to avoid offending the user, they will just agree even though the user might say things that are a little wrong, not necessarily harmful, but harmful in a subtle way. And so this is important. The other thing is also misalignment that's also very important to test, and we need to think more critically and creatively about, because these models are getting more powerful, and so they have now the ability to score very high according to your metrics or reward model, whatever, but at the same time they can diverge from the developer's goal, and that's very problematic, and we need ways on how to measure that. The other thing that I would say before, besides novelty, is difficulty and complexity of the task. We really need to think about how we can develop harder and difficult benchmarks. We have to really avoid the problem of benchmark saturation. Right now we can develop a benchmark, and within a few days, even weeks, these models can score very highly there. And so we know that solving, as I mentioned earlier, solving the data set doesn't mean that the model really developed the underlying skill to solve a particular task. So we have to all the time keep iterating on the data set. And this brings me to the other one, I think, dynamic data set. We really need to move away from a static data set, and this has been the case in the machine learning community for years now. And in my opinion, similar to how we actually write code and we push the code and create pull requests and we refactor our code, it should be the same practice that we do for these data sets. We should be able to dynamically improve or upgrade. And also, it's okay to deprecate certain data sets. We say, okay, this data set is super easy. The model is performing quite well on it. It doesn't provide any new insight to us. So let's move on. Let's upgrade it, or let's decide to completely get rid of it. What other thing? Obviously, we have to make it also multi-turn. Single turn is great but as a start, but it doesn't necessarily capture the multiple interactions that happen with the user, so we might be missing on certain important skills. And I think here, probably if I want to be more specific towards having a more universal AI model, is that we have multiple millions of users using it around the world, and so I think the benchmark needs to take into account certain criteria like pluralistic, like participatory, like the data set should actually test different values for different background, different culture, and different language.
Thank you. And I think I really like your point highlighting the importance of data. Yeah. There's a whole discussion, a whole different event we could do plunging deep into to AI data. Jan, what would you add about how you build a good benchmark?
Yeah, it's not much about adding, it's maybe emphasizing some of the things which you already said. One, it's obviously to avoid contamination. That's very clear that these models are trained on all the possible data they can find. The data is a bottleneck. So of course, they're going to be trained on the benchmarks themselves if they are available. Sometimes even without knowing. So that's number one. The number two is the benchmark, saturation. So I think that you always want to, like as the models grows into sophistication, and then, they're going to do well on most benchmarks. Once you are going to be at 90% and so forth, you are all saturated. You are going to talk only about, 1%, 2%. So I think that's, for instance, on Chatbot Arena, we identified a set of questions which we called Arena Hard. And there are harder questions which kind of try to increase the delta between, the models which are similar in power on the general benchmarks. So that's the second point. The third point, I think, is very important to consider that a lot of this is not only about math questions or where is clearly what is the right answer or the wrong answer, right? But it's about what people feel it's a good answer or not. Right, so actually having the people in the loop doing the evaluation is extremely important. And people say, and actually, say, oh, okay, but this is have a lot of things people complaining, and it's the style of the model, because this kind of the stylistic is better. Users are preferring it. And we did all these studies, and we can actually account for the stylistic differences. We can factor out the bias. And basically, by the way, a parenthesis here. Once you know if you have enough data, you can factor out the bias. So actually, the problem is not the biases you know. The problem is about the biases you do not know, because that's what you cannot factor out. But anyway, so we can do that. And actually, if you look at the latest incarnation of the Chatbot Arena, you can select to factor out these biases, the vibe, and things like that. But the truth is that, the people are people, right? So they like some kind of style better than the other one. So it's good to know that as well, right? And what is safe or not, it depends also on the cultural background and things like that, right? If something is offensive in US, maybe not if you offensive in whatever, I'm not going to say another country, but you can imagine that, right? So I think this kind of cultural dimension is also extremely important. So I think that you need, when we are talking here, not about one benchmark, it's a kind of a battery of benchmarks for different tasks, for different culture and so forth. And the last point I want to make is that I also thought that in some sense, testing, benchmarking these models, it's not unlike testing people, right? If you look at people and how we test people, it's very similar, right? We try to avoid contamination. Or contamination means for people, you know the problems in the exam before the exam, you take the exam, right? That's contamination, right? So you always come with new problems in every exam. Every exam it's once and done. And this is the same thing. You are going to have exams for different fields, for different subjects. And I think it's a problem which we are dealing, I'm talking here as a faculty, right? It's like, it's a final, this is a final week of classes. The next week are the exams, right? So so I think that getting some inspiration for how we as humans evaluate humans is not it's something to look at. So I'll stop here for now.
Thank you. Wansi, particularly from a policy perspective, what are the characteristics of a good benchmark?
That's a very good question that we're always asking ourselves, actually. I wish we have a guide or methodology that this is how you build a good benchmark, right? Or this is how you assess if a benchmark is good. And talking about benchmark assessing models, we also need to assess benchmarks. From a policy perspective, definitely, I think it always comes from what are the safety concerns that we want to measure. first, right? And then are we actually measuring these safety concerns, whether it's from a taxonomy of safety issues that we've identified or certain use cases in certain use cases and contexts. So are the benchmarks actually measuring these issues? Are they representing the range of users that are going to be engaging with the model, in dealing with these issues? Is the data set that's being used to generate the benchmark put together in a way that doesn't introduce any bias or other concerns or other problems? One of the most common questions I get asked is, how many questions should there be in the data set, right? Talking about a benchmark, should we be asking 1,000 questions, 100,000 questions? And I think it's highly also dependent on how much we're measuring, right? Someone told me 1,000 for one topic may be the big rule that we can stick to, but I don't know. I don't think we have landed on that clearly yet. So there are all of these issues that the previous panelists have highlighted as well, right? Making sure that we think about the saturation, there's no contamination. So we also had a lot of discussions around public and private benchmarks. Should benchmarks be public completely? There are usefulness, there's certain use to having public benchmarks, then, more people can use them. They can actually run them on different models, and then they can improve on them as well and understand where the current state of the art is. But at the same time, we worry about, as previous panelists have already said, models being trained on these benchmarks. So quite a lot of discussions on benchmarks. And I think maybe one of the other areas that we seldom talk about then is how do we measure, what are the metrics that we want to put in place in measuring, in identifying performance. So it's also what are some of the scoring mechanisms, open-ended and closed-ended questions and answers, as well as someone said earlier, putting in place the human to actually look at the answers and say this is right or wrong as initial step of understanding where we stand. Agree also with the previous panelists on different values. So how then do we actually look at the result from a safety benchmark, especially, right? Values are important, and then being able then to understand where this, what will be acceptable in different cultures when it comes to the results. So these are various areas or various issues relating to benchmarks. Like I said at the beginning, I think if someone writes this is a methodology for building benchmarks, I think that would be super useful for all of us. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's interesting to see the methodology evolve. I think the hidden test, practice, test approach we took in AILuminate hopefully can help with some of the things you're describing, the balance of transparency and resistance to cheating. And ask a couple of specific questions. And Jan, I'd like to start with you. Chatbot Arena has become a very popular benchmark, I think in part because people can understand it. You give a prompt to 2 different systems, and you pick the one you like better, and that system gets a point, so to speak, and that results in a leaderboard. Could you talk a little bit about the importance of transparency and understandability, especially for non-experts, people who aren't, all of us thinking all the time about safety and benchmarking?
Yeah, so, yeah, sorry, there is a little bit of echo, which is, so yeah, with Chatbot Arena, like you said, it's a in the wild benchmark. You go to the site, you ask a question, and we provide answer from 2 anonymized models. It's multi-turn, you can go multi-turn, and then you can pick which answer you believe is better, or maybe whether both are good or both are bad. And then we inspire originally, like, of course, I'm not going to go into details, but we inspire, then we compute a rating which is inspired from, chess, right? Where chess players are rated using ELO rating. And basically, in some sense, if you beat a stronger player, you are going to get a bigger bump than if you beat a weaker player, right? And this is, kind of a very nice model, because the models, there are, you cannot play a model for the same question against every other model. And this kind of rating it's also pretty dynamic. It can change in time and things like that. So, so I thought we found that it was a good model. And again, we don't take as much credit. We just kind of copied what we saw, look around, and we saw kind of it's working in other fields. And then what happens actually right now is that people ask more and more questions, so things becomes more and more interesting. And like for instance, first we have only one score, right? Overall score. Now we have scores by categories, math and reasoning, English by language and things like that. Then, like I mentioned earlier, people said, it was a very good question. Hey, but look, it's like this is people prefer this model because provides the answer is better formatted, right, than the other one, right? So or the language is kind of many times the people prefer actually the more verbose answers, okay? Many times also they prefer the first answer, right? So looking a lot of time in this kind of bias coming from the people, and try to factor it out, right? So now you can look and say, okay, if you want to factor out the kind of formatting or something like that, you can see, how the model the ranking changes, and it does change, right? So and then you have also obviously multimodality, right? Now it's a lot about text to image, or and text to video and things like that. And then you have a little bit more, even more kind of task oriented, right? We have right now, for instance, for Copilot, it's a popular application. How do you compare those, right? Which one is better, right? We have now a version, basically you can, basically it's done with some colleagues from CMU, actually. It's, they lead this work, if you use, is integrated with Visual Code, and you get now, instead of one suggestion for a Copilot, you get two suggestions, and you you pick one of those. So what we and by the way, the parenthesis here, it's a very strong position bias. People prefer the first answer. So what we are seeing here is that it's very complex. The space is hugely complex. So I think that going back on what she said, I think that it's extremely important to try to figure out what makes a good benchmarks. What are the rules for a good benchmark? Because we are going to have a lot of benchmarks, right? Because they are so general, right? These models. So yeah, so we learn a lot in the process, and there are still a lot of questions which needs to be answered. Like for instance, freshness is another question, right? Like because this is in the wild, we are still releasing some 20% of the answers and the votes, right? And we don't release more because we want to try to avoid overfitting, right? But is that this is valuable only if it's you always kind of, you have a certain number of prompts are fresh, right? So is that the case? And what is that kind of, the number of fresh questions? Even what a fresh question, it's interesting question, right? No pun intended, right? How you know that, oh, this question is really a different question, right? It's like, so it's huge space.
It's, in some ways, the essence of good benchmarking is we're trying to take these incredibly complex problems and distill them down into information people can understand.
Yeah. So yeah, go
I
ahead.
sorry, I just want to stop you there, Jan, because I want to make sure we get through a
Yeah.
couple more answers in our very limited remaining time. So I'm gonna do the lightning answer round. So Nouha, one of the things I wanted to point to with your work at AI2 is the OMO models, and we used an older version of an OMO model as essentially a control in our initial testing. We wanted something that was a legitimate model but was older and not safety tuned to show, frankly, that it wouldn't do so well on a benchmark like this. But going forward, we'd love to work with organizations like yours to develop very open, sort of gold standard reference models that everyone understands and use those to help set our curve. Could you talk a little bit about OMO2 and your plans in this direction?
Yeah, very good question. I think the main motto of OMO2 and AI2 is openness and transparency. So we're not just being open, we're being more than open. So we're releasing models, we're releasing data, we're releasing every single detail of the pipeline development of these AI models, from the simple hyperparameter search to how we collected the data, what kind of training method we use. And I think that by creating this transparent and publicly accessible resources we can actually help evaluating models and also comparing the performance of these models. And this is particularly important because we can that way understand why certain models performed this well on this benchmark or poorly on this benchmark. And I know that there are lots of models already in the community that are open weights, but we're still lacking the data that they were trained on. And I think that's, we know that data plays a critical role in the performance of the model. Like, yes, having access to the model weights, it's not enough. It's great, but it's not enough to understand what has led to a certain behavior. So we need to do that. And I think that openness will provide transparency and scrutiny, and most importantly, the understanding of the inner working of these models. And it's really challenging, and this is why we're being open, because I think that the achieving certain goals in advancing AI models is not the job of one single institute or a lab, but it's more like a collective effort towards figuring out the main issues. And so we're trying to empower the entire community to perform and conduct research and advance science around these models. So we're hoping with AI2, with OMO2, with also Tulu 3 models, people will get to understand better how to build these models, and most importantly, how to monitor them and how to make them safe and to advance them. And so, yeah.
We really look forward to working more closely with you to try and create like the gold kilogram under glass, for AI safety, and that openness is truly helpful there. Wansi, I wanted to ask you how you see increased global cooperation. We talk about trying to make a global standard as being really important in the AI benchmarking space.
Yeah, definitely. I think we spoke a little bit about different values and different cultures having different expectations, for example. So having a common set of benchmarks for us to look at together, I think that's a good start. I think the taxonomy that's been defined is useful for at least for that first conversation. Does this make sense to everyone around the world, right? I think I spoke, I think at one of our earlier events together, Peter talked about finding that universal set of concerns that everyone has. I think is useful. So global cooperation in having these discussions is definitely important. And then identifying where it's specific to cultures. And it's not just in terms of the questions that are asked, but also in understanding the responses that have been generated through the benchmark. some may be acceptable to some cultures and some may not be, right? So having that understanding is important. So the global cooperation to get to that level of detail and understanding will be useful. And the other area in which we cooperate is really then in making sure that these benchmarks are available in different languages, that can then, again, not just test for performance in different languages, but also test for whether some safeguards break down in different languages when it comes to certain models, right? So we are quite happy to be working together in this area. I mean, from Singapore, the AI Foundation is helping with developing evaluators in different languages actually to evaluate the output, right? It's not just about translating questions, but also looking at output and being able to evaluate the outputs on whether these are safe or unsafe, and being able to score them across a different set of agreed metrics.
Great, thank you.
So many things that we can do together, actually, globally as a community, to help, improve safety. And I think starting with actually looking at the benchmarks together, addressing questions of your evaluators, these are good ways to start. Thanks.
So last question goes to you, April. In particular, I think safety is often presented as either being good for society or a burden on industry. Do you think that is true? How do you see this work as being potentially beneficial to both?
Yeah, I think there's been a false narrative when it pits safety against innovation, when in fact I think one advances the other. So what we're focused on is we're focused on adoption. So we want to build technologies that are useful and that are trustworthy. In order to build that trust, we need to be able to be transparent about what our models are capable of doing, the potential gaps that still exist, and the potential risks. So this happens across a number of different areas. So as a model provider, what we need to do is we need to focus on some foundational and broad understandings around safety, and we need to make that transparent. And then for those who are model adopters, so users, developers, businesses, and organizations, they need to take this information that's being provided and develop context-specific and use case-specific guardrails and mitigation strategies. Because until we get to a place where people feel confident that these models are safe, that these models are trustworthy, it's not going to be a good product experience for users. So ultimately, safety and adoption, they go hand in hand, and those together advance innovation for real use cases, which is how we're going to live the promise of this technology.
Thank you very much, April. One last quick question from the audience about the training data for AI2. And so you're releasing the training data. Okay. So with that, we're going to wrap up our panel. And thank you very much, everyone, for the context you provided. Really great to see these different perspectives, industry, civil society, academia, policy, coming together on this very important question. That is what we are trying to do with this benchmark. In many ways, and it may not be obvious, in AI, the test is the design. The test for safety, if we all agree on a standard, it gives a consistent definition of safety for people to build towards, for people to buy with confidence. There's a lot of value in that. It refines questions like, what exactly are we testing? Is it the model or the model plus guardrails? I know some of the systems we tested, now they're releasing guardrails. Mistral's out with theirs. Meta has very clear guardrails in a Docker stack. So we're really beginning to answer these questions about how you build composite systems and what you should expect from them. These are the kind of questions that we can answer with a standard benchmark and a standard methodology. So once again, just wanted to give a great thank you to everyone who's helped us, our panelists today, our speakers, everyone in the MLCommons community who's come together to help us build and launch this benchmark and start this process of defining a production perspective on AI safety. Thank you all. And thank you everyone for coming today.